E hoa mā, nau mai, haere mai ki tō tātou kōrero I tēnei ata. Welcome, friends, to the session this morning. Ko Christina hauara hau, ko kai whakahaere hau ki te Todd Foundation. I am the Executive Director of the Todd Foundation. And for those who don't know the Todd Foundation, we're a family foundation, not a corporate philanthropy, which sometimes people think we are. We are about 45 years old. We're just under 4 staff. I don't have half a staff member, but some of my staff are part-timers. And we are at the moment giving away just under $4 million a year. So that's kind of the scale of us. I've been 9 years with the Todd Foundation, coming into my 10th year, and this is my 5th year as the Executive Director. Gael.
Kia ora koutou, ko Gael Surgenor takuino. I'm the Director of Community and Social Innovation at Auckland Council. Have a fantastic job on the edge of the council, in that space in between community and government, philanthropy and business. And I've been at the council for just on 7 years, and in the social innovation role for about 4 years. Before that, I had some time in central government, and before that, number of years in the community and social enterprise sector. So, yes, it's a bit daunting to be here now, and it's all very well when Christina rings up and says, will you co-present this workshop with me, and then the day arrives. And Marcus gave a great advertisement for our session, so I'm sure some people are here because the other sessions are full. So we want to start with a little bit of chat at your tables on system change. It's a term that pops up everywhere now, and the fact that this workshop was well subscribed, I guess, shows that there's interest in what is it. Christina and I are not claiming to be experts. We're grappling in this space like a number of other people, and I can see people in the audience here who are peers and colleagues and perhaps even further down the path than we are. So we hope that this is an exchange of our present grappling with this idea, and we'll share some of our experience in the world of philanthropy, but also in the doing of systems change. So if we could start with talking to the person next to you about what do you understand system change to mean in your context? So spend a few minutes talking to the person next to you about the idea of system change. Or a committee member.
Sorry, that's right. Committee member. Ian's next.
Or I could just do that.
Yeah, you do that.
Yeah. Where's the timer?
So it'll start when we clock on the first slide.
Oh, okay.
So start and look over to here. I assume you told me it would be on the full bed, so
How long should we let this run for?
it's still looking quite I've got one of these watches which doesn't really.
Give it another minute. So another minute or so Okay, can we wrap that little conversation up? I'd like to get an idea of how many people in the room feel like they're in the middle of grappling with systems change. They're really in the business of systems change. Could you raise your hands? Oh, that's a lot of people. How many people are curious about it, starting on that journey, but haven't really launched into it yet? And how many people is it a brand new concept and you're here purely out of curiosity and you haven't read anything or been in conversations about this topic before? Okay, so lots of experience and practice in the room, so we'll do our best to harness that and get you contributing, because we're here really just to stimulate conversation and share some of our experience.
Yes, we did design this as kind of an introduction to systems change, so those of you who are feeling really confident, if you want to go somewhere else now, this is your opportunity. So what we might do is try and zip through reasonably quickly some of the, introductory why systems change and what it is, which is actually a huge topic and we can't cover it in any depth anyway. And maybe spend a bit more time talking about our experiences and what we've found is trying to do and fund systems change, if that works for you guys. Okay. So yeah, just skipping over the first 10 slides. No, I'm not going to do that. I'll just click the button. Oh, I'm not getting the presenter view, just FYI. So I guess the question that and the starting premise that we all sit around the table as funders and doers is that we want to make a difference. And that covers, probably everyone in the room here, from government to philanthropy to public, people who are community organisations. We're all here because we want things to be better in some way for the people or the planet. And what we find is that as funders in particular, we tend to have our extremely broad, bold and aspirational visions. And if you don't have one, there are plenty of consultants out there that will help you write one. And that's interesting. We have these big visions. So can anyone here, we're probably small enough, does anyone know their organisational vision and want to yell it out to us? Tell us what it is that your organisation has on their vision statement and what you want to achieve.
Reduce inequality.
Okay, that's just a small thing that you're wanting to do. That's awesome. Anyone else?
Make Rotorua a better place.
Okay, so that's quite bold, broad. For the whole of Aotearoa, a better place could cover a lot of stuff. Yep.
Achieve equity for Māori.
Yep. So again, that's just a small ask, Edu, on the scale of, our current systems in New Zealand. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, so we have these bold aspirational visions, and you're not alone in that. This is the Todd Foundation vision. That's good. I was a bit worried about how those slides were going to show up on the big screen. So our vision is an inclusive Aotearoa New Zealand where all families, children and young people can thrive and contribute. Whakawhai te Aotearoa, hei oranga wairua, oranga tangata. I've also put up the Peter McKenzie Project vision, because Gael didn't mention, but she's a committee member on the Peter McKenzie Project, and I see the head of the Peter McKenzie Project sitting here, so, shout out to Ian. Ngā mihi e tōkana. Yeah, so another big bold vision. Imagine an Aotearoa New Zealand where all our children and young people are mokopuna flourish. He oranga tamariki, he oranga whānau, he oranga tāngata. So we've got these big bold visions. And yet, unfortunately, despite that, and despite all the work that we've all been doing over the last 40 years, actually things aren't getting better. We don't seem to be moving towards our visions in any significant way. And a lot of the things that we all care about, and particularly for the Todd Foundation and Peter McKenzie, for example, income inequality, child abuse, homelessness, suicide, our statistics are getting worse. So what we have been doing isn't working, unfortunately. The things that we funded, all of the programs, all of the services, all of the interventions, all of the innovation labs, all of the stuff that we've been doing, it's not making a dent. And we all know that the definition of insanity is keeping doing the same thing that you've always done and expecting different results. So I think this is the reason why systems change is becoming increasingly popular, and why more people are going, what is it that we could be doing? Is there another way? Is there something that we can change? So the next slide is a video. As a presenter, that it's always a little bit nerve-wracking putting a video in a presentation. Will the audio work? Will it actually go? So fingers crossed it does. Unfortunately, neither the Todd Foundation or TSI have money to do cool videos and animations. But luckily, the foundation set up by the eBay founders in the US does have lots of money. I don't know how that happened, but the Imagia group is the foundation, the philanthropic effort of the eBay funders, and they put this little video together to talk about the why of systems change for them. So let's see if that actually plays. Yay! With audio. That we can hear. Nope. There's someone working very, very quickly.
To give meaningful value to the world. But sometimes we wonder, will it get us to the enduring change we are ultimately hoping to see?
There are times when we encounter roadblocks. It can feel like the movie Groundhog Day when, despite our solutions, we see the same problems over and over again.
Or when we solve one problem, another pops up somewhere else, like a game of whack-a-mole.
Most confusing of all is when we find ourselves in opposite day, where our solutions somehow end up making things even worse.
It's what some blood banks found when they tried to increase donations by paying donors. But they found that this actually demotivated altruistic people, which led to fewer donations overall.
Or take homelessness. People have poured resources into funding shelters to address homelessness, but in many large cities, this didn't reduce the overall number of people ending up on the streets. The question is, why?
It's because shelters were never meant to provide a path to sustainable living, and because job training programs can't make a dent if there are no economic opportunities.
And no one program can address the underlying challenges. These factors are all interconnected and interwoven.
This is a truer representation of reality, but it's confusing, frustrating, and messy. It can be hard to know what to do with this mess.
So we've challenged ourselves to add to our toolkit. We believe that systems thinking can help. Systems thinking is a mindset, a collection of tools, and processes for engaging with our messy world.
Systems thinking helps us gain clarity by making sense of complex environments and understanding the interconnections.
It helps us find leverage and reveal points in a system where modest actions have the potential for significant impact.
It helps us adapt so we can engage with constantly changing environments and see the ripple effects of our actions within the broader context of the system.
Together, systems thinking helps us to gain clarity about a complex problem in order to find leverage, so we may act strategically with confidence. When we see the effects of our actions on the system, we learn and adapt, and these lessons fuel a virtuous cycle.
We've looked for examples where systems thinking was making a difference. In Calhoun County, Michigan, service providers decided to use systems thinking to tackle the issue of homelessness.
What they realized when they looked at the whole system was that funders and providers were actually incentivized to choose quick fixes, even when they knew it wouldn't lead to sustained change. Shifting that pattern wasn't easy, but systems mapping helped them see where they could intervene to change how the system behaved and to increase funding for higher leverage approaches like Housing First. This helped decrease homeless numbers in Calhoun County, despite the fact that unemployment was going up.
Our approach here at the Imagia Group is constantly evolving to incorporate insights from many fields. We believe this kind of systems thinking is a powerful addition to our toolkit.
We look forward to partnering with you and learning together as we
just going to skip over that because I don't think they fund in New Zealand, so let's just move on. But I think that I really like that little animation because it illustrates the stuff that we see as funders often. We have this helicopter view, If you've been in the sector and if you've been funding for any length of time, you do see this, it's kind of like, well, why this problem is coming up over and over again, or we thought we fixed that, we had that great program and then they got a government contract, and why have we still got this issue? And I want to just talk about a little bit of how seeing that pattern. I like the examples they use there, Groundhog Day, whack-a-mole, stuff things down into the holes, and opposites days where you think you've solved one problem and you've actually caused another. And the pattern that I saw play out we've seen play out at the Todd Foundation and me personally is around the solutions for youth employment. So New Zealand has had a problem with youth unemployment or disengagement for a really long time, and in 2005 my very first job in government was setting up a evaluation program for the Youth Transition Service, which was the government's attempt at that time to solve this issue. And the ideal was, so this was in 2005, their aspirational vision was that by 2007 all 15 to 19-year-olds would be in work, education or training. So, spoiler alert, that didn't actually happen. Might have noticed. So, the government solution was we'll set up a service, it'll be called Youth Transition Service. We're going to track all school leavers leaving school. And we're going to follow up with those who weren't engaged, and we're going to make sure that they just are doing something. We'll support them into work or training or employment. We're going to develop a service specification within MSD, and it was really, it was well researched. They went and found some community organisations and programs that were already running that were successful and tried to pull out the good bits of those and create this specification. They then contracted that out to NGO providers. They did a 5-region pilot, extended that to 14 regions and funded that until 2012. I'm sure it was evaluated because I set up the evaluation, but there's no information about that evaluation anywhere on the MSD website. I haven't OIA'd it, but I might one day, just out of interest, to see where that information went. But what happened in 2012 was that Youth Transition Service was discontinued. The government decided that they were going to do something different with that money. It was going to be more targeted. It was going to go specifically to people 16 to 18-year-olds receiving a benefit, and there was going to be really, targeted support. There is an evaluation of that on the MSD website. Seems to be showing some promising results at the moment. And there's more NGOs that contracted to deliver it. But the kicker is that between 2004 and 2018, our overall rate of NEETs in New Zealand, so young people not in education, training or work, rose. So we had 10% in 2004, we had 12% in 2018. And that is despite our overall unemployment rate actually going down there was highs following the GFC, but our overall unemployment rate has gone down, our youth NEETs rate has gone up. So despite all of the millions of dollars and time and energy and whatever that's been poured into these programs, nothing's changed, it's got worse. So I am quite sure that you can all think of some examples in your community where you've seen that. The same problems persist, the solution to one problem seems to create another, or solutions seem to end up making things worse. So I just want to spend a little bit of time at your tables maybe talking about some of those, if you have examples of those, things that you can share with other people, just to sort of get a sense that, we're all maybe grappling with some of this in different spaces. So you'll have different communities, you have different focus areas, but what are some of the things that you're seeing that are similar? 5 minutes, quick discussion. maybe just take a minute to wrap up your discussion, and then I'd be just interested to hear one or two examples that people might have talked about if the people who are really good at shouting want to volunteer. Okay, I'm just going to stop you there and bring that conversation to a close. Yeah, and maybe if there's anyone who just wants to share, I'm not going to ask every table to go around and share something, but if there's a couple of people who feel quite confident about sharing briefly what their persistent problem that doesn't seem to have been amenable to solutions is, that would be great. Joan. Okay, cool. Thank you. Anyone else? Johnny.
Just experience in the UK working in a charity called Skill Course, which was dealing with about 10,000 kids a year that were neat but not educated for the thing. Our intervention programs were national, but nevertheless the need figure just didn't shift, And the observation was that there came to be this belief, rightly or wrongly, that there was almost a natural level of need, despite our best efforts, we weren't going to change. And the more objective among us just kind of came to the conclusion, actually, what it was really about was just the fragmentation of effort. So we were one of many, many people trying to tackle the problem, and as a consequence, we weren't actually achieving truly collective impact. So, I don't know, it's not a great thing, but it's an acceptance that there's some we're not going to get to.
Thanks, Johnny. Anyone else?
We were talking last night about Jahu Tereo, which is a good program teaching post-service teachers about Māori language, because the big thing with Angatai is them still saying people can't pronounce their names.
Yes.
But again, it's a program when you have all of these teachers' colleges spitting out teachers that aren't culturally responsive
Yeah.
and can't engage. And so rather than a program, how do you fix it at the source?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think, I don't know if you all heard that, but that was the problem of our teachers not being actually able to pronounce the names of our Māori children. And that's, to me, actually, that's quite shocking. You shouldn't actually have to go to school in New Zealand and have a teacher who can't say your name and who shortens your name or gives you a nickname because your name is too hard for them to pronounce. I grew up in Whakatane and that was not so much of an issue, thankfully. Our teachers were pretty staunch on that stuff, so it's very lucky. Sorry, my teachers were. I don't know about all the teachers. So I think I really appreciate those examples. And one of the things that I think actually, this is my perspective, but I think it's part of a systems thinking, holds all of those problems in place is that we tend to locate problems with individuals rather than systems. We tend to think that if we can just fix up the individual people, the individual teachers, the individual young people who haven't got work, the individuals who are homeless and on the street, then we will fix the problem. What systems thinking and systems change and systems approaches ask us to do is go, actually, maybe the problem is with the system, not with the people, and that's where we should start focusing our efforts. So an example of this is, I'm going to take one right out of my scope, but actually something I'm really personally concerned about is the global plastic pollution problem. Yeah. So for many years we didn't even recognise we had a problem, and when we did, we situated the problem with individuals, and it was like, well, there's too many people are just littering, or they're not recycling properly, or they're drinking too much Coke, or, all of those things were, and all of that stuff was an individual problem. And, conscious consumerism is going to save us when people stop buying stuff in plastic bottles and buy it in other places. So those are individual problems to something which is actually a really systemic issue. I don't know if you've tried not buying things in plastic. It's really, really, really hard. You have to try really hard if you want to buy a condiment, if you want to buy your tomato sauce in a glass bottle or a tin, good luck to you, because you are not going to be able to. So that is part of the problem that we have. So if you want to take a systems approach to this problem, you actually start doing things like, do we even have functional rubbish collection in some places? That we look at places like Indonesia and all the rest of it, and we think, oh, it's terrible, there's all this rubbish going into the river. Do we even have functional rubbish collection systems to deal with all of this new plastic which is being foisted on people by corporations? What is the economics of consumer-led recycling? That's really been brought home to us with China saying, sorry, not going to take your crap anymore. What is driving the production of plastic packaging in the first place? So there's all of this systems level stuff, and the change that is required to deal with the scale of this problem is going to happen at systems. It is not going to happen by you and me using bamboo toothbrushes instead of plastic ones, if you can find them. I'm not saying that those individual level actions are not important, because I think they are, and I think that once you see problems, you feel like you need to do something to deal with them, and they raise consciousness and they get people thinking. But, it's 10,000 kids writing to MPs and saying we need a plastic bag ban that actually does stuff. It's those kinds of regulatory solutions and pressure being put on the causes of the problem rather than the consumers that actually make a difference. So, and I'm really pleased actually, Ani and Vu this morning have really set that up for us, so I probably don't need to convince you too much more. So let's move on to what does this mean for funders. So my personal belief is that to make real progress towards our vision as funders, we need to fund different things, but more importantly, we need to fund differently. So, Vu's kind of banged that into our heads this morning, and what I want to talk about for me is what the journey the Todd Foundation has been on to try and do that, because it's not easy to change when you've been doing things the same way for a really long time. So also want to let you know that if you want to embark on this journey, you will be in really good company. So big funders in the US, in the UK, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Kellogg Foundation, the Big Lottery Fund, Lang Kelly Chase in UK, in Europe, the Bosch Foundation. Everyone's, this is a shift in thinking that is occurring around the world. So, we've come to it reasonably new within philanthropy in New Zealand. The idea of thinking about things as part of systems is really grounded in Te Ao Māori. It's a Te Ao Māori way of thinking, so I want to acknowledge that as well, that our Western way of intellectual modelling is very individualistic and not connected, and so again we've got models within Aotearoa that can help us with this. I'm going to hand over to Gael to talk a little bit about funding things differently and what systems change means. So.
We're going to share some of the resources or the ways that people have been thinking about system change. And how many people have seen this model before and read the paper on the water of systems change? A few people. Well, I'd really recommend it because it's been created by some of the people that came up with the collective impact concept in collaboration with Peter Senge, who's a world-renowned systems thinker. And I found this model really helpful for thinking about how we're tackling systems change. We tend to think, or the most common way of approaching systems change is that we think we need to change policy or legislation with government and do advocacy to make change happen at that level. And there are some great efforts that have achieved results in that space, or changing practices, procedures, the shared habits and ways of doing things. even addressing resource flows and which is money and knowledge and information, and disseminating that and distributing that across the system. But we're not so good at the semi-explicit or the implicit levels of attention to system change. So the relationships and connections, I think philanthropy particularly has done quite a lot in that space of convening people around a particular challenge or an issue. Perhaps not so much addressing the power dynamics, and we heard about that this morning. This is something that really needs attention. How do we share power? How do we recognise informal power and influence and make that more explicit in our efforts? And then at the mental models triangle, that's really getting underneath what are the beliefs and assumptions and ways of thinking about some of these challenges. And Jess Berenson-Shaw and Marion Elliott, who are doing another workshop at this time, are really in that space, and I think there's some exciting work that they're undertaking. So if we just tackle systems change at the structural level, we might see some change happen immediately, but it's not necessarily sustainable. You think about how governments change and things that were happening revert back. So to get sustainable transformational change, we have to be working at all three levels. If we just focus at the structural level, then we won't get that mind shift or way of framing up some of these issues in a way that gets the mobilisation of people needed to make that change sustainable. Also being able to see the system, this is something I've learnt working with Ian and others for the Peter McKenzie project. That initiative made an intentional decision to support initiatives that were going to tackle systems change for child and family wellbeing and to reduce child and family poverty. What we realised fairly soon on is that this is a field that we need to build capability in. Lots of proposals were just for great programs and services, but they weren't really getting at the systems level. They certainly weren't working on those three different levels. And what I've learnt personally is that this is a challenge to change the way that we see, think and act about things. And that doesn't just happen by reading an article or thinking about it. We actually have to develop different faculties and exercise different muscles in our approaches to things. Like we have to be able to get better at seeing things at the periphery, or as that diagram, the elephant shows, is that if we are only seeing what's in front of us, then we'll see the body of the elephant as a wall, or the ear as a fan, or the tail as a rope. Building that capacity to be able to step back and see the system is essential to do this work. And if we don't build the capacity to see the system, then the systems change work gets caught in that a lot of talk about it, but not a lot of results to achieve it. And I think sometimes we're in that talk about it, but because we can't see it, then we can't really act in a way that's going to achieve the transformation. So what that requires, the work that requires of all of us, I think, and it's certainly been my journey, is that we have to use different faculties, like the ability to observe or take notice of things differently, to empathise with the people affected by the system, but also to have empathy for the system, to be much better at reflective practice and learning, trying some things and reflecting and learning on what's working. So to build that capacity and skills is, I think, really important. And it's something that we are still learning how to do, and it's something that we're currently grappling with in the Peter McKenzie project about how do we build leadership in systems innovation and systems change. So maybe people here have got some thoughts on that, and I think that would be a great conversation for philanthropy to have across the sector really, is what role can philanthropy play in building that systems leadership.
Thanks, Gail. So, where do you start with systems? I love this diagram. It's like, yeah, once you actually start doing those things and start trying to see the system and understand it, what you end up with is diagrams that look like this. And they are complex, and they try and think about all the parts of the system and where they connect, and where there might be bits that are just frozen and are going to be really hard to change, and where there might be bits where there's some energy or some leverage. So this is a tool that people use in systems thinking, which is mapping systems. And the really important thing about this, and I've used fisheries because I think ecosystems designers and ecological thinkers are much better at this. They've been doing this for a really long time. Ecologists know that everything is dependent on everything else. And they really understand that and work with that. We kind of have known it but tried to ignore it. So because what we have done in the social sector is build our models of how change is going to happen to look something like this for a very long time. So, and I'm just putting my hand on this 5 years of my life was doing this kind of work. Let us create a program logic, and then we will look at what the situation and the problem is. We'll decide what our inputs are. We'll think about our outputs, our activities, our participation. We'll create, some short and medium term outcomes, which will be proxies for our long-term impact, because we know that's going to be 10 years away. We'll think about our assumptions, and we'll just acknowledge that there's some external factors, but they're kind of peripheral to the main point of this model. So does this look familiar to anyone here? Yeah. And so this is the mental mode, the mode of thinking that we have been stuck in. We've been thinking about change. It's a very linear model, and what it does is it simplifies reality in order to make things easier to measure and to manage. But unfortunately, by seeking to do that, to make the work easier to manage, we've actually made it harder to achieve positive change. That's my personal belief. So if systems look more like this, and this may be familiar to you, Ian. Ian and my team spent some time learning about doing the systems mapping and starting to develop a system map. So if they look more like this, maybe we need to start thinking about our models of change in a different way. And maybe this is a bit more of a useful model for thinking about how we might start to achieve or create some positive change. So again, completely and shamelessly plagiarising this. We didn't develop this ourselves. It's from some research which I will flick up on the next slide. But the idea of this model is that the first thing that you need to do is understand the system and work with players to understand the system. Build relationships and trust. We've talked about trust the whole way through this. So that's a really important part of the understanding the system, because you need as many players as possible to help you understand that system. When you're trying to build that systems map, the people with lived experience are the ones that are going to be able to fill in your gaps. They're going to be seeing the bit of the elephant that you're not seeing, okay? Probably quite a lot of the elephant. They may be underneath the elephant. In fact, they probably are underneath the elephant. Well, you're kind of standing over here thinking, oh, isn't that elephant lovely? And the person who's in the system is going, this elephant is crushing the life out of me. So that's really important. And then moving into some co-design, because actually we don't know what works. We love having what works, let's have a what works section on our website, and when we're assessing our funding applications, let's have a look at what works. Well, we don't often we don't really know what works because nothing's been working very well. So co-designing, trying to come up with some new ideas, experimenting, so being open to the fact that you're going to try a thing, get some quick feedback, see if it looks like it's going in the right direction. If it's not, do something else. And go round that cycle, and then maybe there's some things that come out of that experimentation that may be worth embedding and influencing others to do. And in the middle is the governance and learning, but exactly what Gael was talking about, that you need a learning mindset and you need governance that is actually sitting in that learning mindset as well, and asking, is this what we intended? What are we going to do next? And who are we to be making these decisions? So that's a really important question. Are we the right people to be deciding if this thing is working or not, or are there other people who can tell us? So the pieces of work that I'm referencing are these two really great resources, and you can Google those, A Whole New World, Funding and Commissioning and Complexity and Exploring the New World. They're produced by some researchers at Newcastle University, which is now they've obviously had some sort of same people, but they've changed organisations. And they were looking at, in the UK, at a combination of funders and service providers and local government who are actually trying to do this. So the research is about, if you're trying to do it, what does it look like? So I really recommend those. And Gail, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about those as well. So.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Christina said about those documents. I found them incredibly useful, and it's amazing to think that people in the north of the UK are grappling with exactly the same challenges that we're having here. And that diagram about experimenting and starting with purpose and doing co-design and experimenting and going through cycles. When we saw that diagram, we could have come up with that ourselves. It really spoke to us about the way that our practice is emerging. So that second report really starts to describe what this work is and talks about human learning systems. And that really resonated for us because we see in South Auckland particularly that the importance of understanding this at a human level, what's happening in people's lives, the diversity of people's experiences, the need to be much more bespoke about what is it that's going to help change to happen, the importance of building empathy between people. And families have told us that a service that is technical without empathy is a disservice. Empathy is just so important. And we've heard about trust this morning too, so that the importance of seeking trust and being trusted is part of that human dimension. Prioritising learning, that's the part of the work that we do that isn't valued enough, I think. We're about getting, what's the result and how have we changed things. The learning process is sometimes the most valuable thing that we can put back into the system or put back into our initiatives and our organisations. So we need to get better at creating learning cultures, using data to learn, quantitative, qualitative, and also to think about funding and commissioning learning, not just delivering services with specified delivery. Especially if we're going to do system change, then we actually have to figure some of these things out. And I'll talk in a minute about an example where we're very fortunate to have that opportunity. And then systems approach, we need to be looking after the health of the systems that we're a part of, creating the conditions for where people can understand the systems in which we're participating, and we're wanting to create more coordination and collaboration. So these are new approaches to social change that really put people and communities at the centre and in leadership roles. So that I'm going to talk 3 slides to talk about the work that I'm in the middle of leading in South Auckland. So TSI is a Southern initiative. It's a place-based priority that Auckland Council put in the Auckland Plan when Auckland Council amalgamated. And the reason for that was that South Auckland is a place that really needs social, economic and physical transformation. It's had 30, 40 years of economic and social shocks that haven't enabled prosperity of locals. People in South Auckland haven't necessarily even recovered from the GFC, the financial crisis of 2008. Some people, we just did a piece of work looking at a mesh block in Mangere of people and their incomes, and things have got worse. So back to what Christina was saying. And we've had to really challenge ourselves because we're a part of council, we're on the edge of council, but we're still part of that big bureaucracy, and communities said to us really clearly, we're sick of being a problem to be fixed. We've had 20, 30 years of well-intentioned initiatives and flying squads come in with answers for South Auckland, programs and services and an abundance of resources, but it hasn't actually got the change at the pace or the scale that's needed. Also linking back to this morning, sometimes what really gets in my belly is that South Auckland is a slow burn social disaster. It's happening every single day, but it's not a big natural disaster like an earthquake, but we're not treating it with the urgency and the focus that I think it requires. What communities said to us was that only the hood can change the hood. We want the opportunity for grassroots, bottom-up solutions. So that was really challenging for us, and how we have responded to that is to see it as South Auckland as an ecosystem, and our role is to help build the health and fitness of the ecosystem of South Auckland so the hood can change the hood. And we've also learnt that what that challenges us to do is to work at 2 levels of scale simultaneously, consistently, and that's at the grassroots level with the people most affected, getting results that build trust and confidence and skills and capability at that grassroots level, whilst at the same time working at a systems change level too. And I want to use just a small practical example of how we've done that with procurement. Because in systems change, we need to look for what are the levers that we can exercise. So for us in the council, the biggest lever we have is the purchasing power of the council. It's a $3 billion business across the council family. And we've been experimenting over the last 4 years, some on-the-ground examples. We've got up to about 20 different projects that we've worked on to demonstrate how social procurement, or changing the way that we procure goods, services and works, can create social outcomes. Now, if we just kept doing that in individual examples or kept going with our 20 to 30, we'd probably just wear ourselves out, and every time we're having to start again. So we've had to keep those on-the-ground projects going so we can demonstrate what's possible, but we've also had to work on the procurement system to change our procurement strategy within the council, to embed the practice in the teams within the council. So now there are social procurement roles being created in Auckland Transport and also in our team. So probably that's enough to say about that, but we could not get the same results either if we just worked at the systems change level, because we've had to help some of our procurement colleagues see the possibilities and deal with some of the mental models about it costs more, or businesses won't engage with it, or it's too hard. The next example I want to use is our work with the early years system, which is supported by the Next Foundation, who've been incredibly courageous and generous to actually fund us not to deliver a service or a program, but to experiment with ways to change the early years system. And the way that we're seeing the system, like that diagram, is not just the early childhood education system, for example, or the health system and what it does in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, but to look at it as family as a system, whānau as a system, the informal support that is in neighbourhoods and with peers, and the layers of more formal system with services and programs, and also the policy settings and the government agencies that are in this space. And what we did first of all, before partnering up with Next, was spend quite a bit of time trying to understand how the early years system operated in South Auckland, what the experience, the lived experience of families, whānau in South Auckland raising children was like. And one of the big insights for us out of that we wouldn't have discovered if we hadn't done that understanding work, was that there's a lot of focus on, as Christina said, the individual, but not a lot of focus on what is the environment around families that needs to change. And our big insight was that families were experiencing compounded, cumulative, prolonged daily stress that leads to toxic stress. So we all experience stress temporarily, and we know what that feels like. You're so overwhelmed you can't think straight. But luckily for me, if that happens, it's temporary. But if you live in really tough circumstances in South Auckland, that's a permanent state. So you're in fright or flight mode permanently. If you can't think straight, you can't make good decisions, you can't solve your own problems, you can't set goals or communicate sometimes in a way that you want to. So our focus is on not how to fix the families, but how to reduce the burden of stress so families can solve their own problems. And built into that for us is the learning process being key. So our experiments are designed to have learning at the centre. We're also going to be tracking system change and outcomes, but our first priority is to focus on learning and to put that back into the local system, the community system, and the national system. And what underpins that is a commitment for that to be whānau-led and participatory. So at all stages of this process, we're going to be involving the people whose lives are most affected. So the last slide is to share a few things that I think we're learning from what we're probably framing up more than systems change as systems innovation. The first point is think like a system, act like an entrepreneur. We've committed quite a lot of our capability building to design thinking and thinking in systems. But we've realised that when you're trying to change the status quo, you can have a lot of good systems work done, you can make the challenge visible, but you just hit up against the status quo and bounce back, and you can never get past the insights phase unless you can find ways around the status quo to execution to be able to show what the change looks like, or actually even start to design a new system that eventually can replace the system that's not working. So I have a team of people who are called social entrepreneurs, and that was quite a deliberate framing of their roles, because an entrepreneur is an entrepreneurial person inside a big organisation, a change maker, a positive disruptor. And I've seen those people thinking like a system and acting like an entrepreneur and actually making things happen inside a big system like the council that people didn't think was possible. Another learning, and I've talked a little bit about this already, but having a strengths-based, not a deficit-based approach, putting whānau at the centre is absolutely key, because there's a lot of well-intentioned initiatives and programs and services, but people who most need them aren't accessing them because we're not designing them around the experiences of whānau. Another learning is that toxic stress, and I think we heard about this a little bit this morning with the keynote speeches, that toxic stress that I talked about that families are experiencing, it's being experienced across the system. The community organisations supporting families are experiencing that kind of compounded, prolonged stress for the reasons we heard this morning, and that really gets in the way of the adaptation and innovation and the reflection or the systems approach that community organisations need to be a part of. We've learnt a lot about the scale, place-based scale, and I know that a lot of trusts have a place-based focus, and there are lots of advantages in working at a place scale because you can wrap your arms around a community, and you can also tailor things for the context. And working with complexity, context is really important. And I think that's one of our bigger challenges, that a lot of initiatives that the government support are designed in Wellington and rolled out across the country. They might work well in a provincial town, but they don't work in the context of South Auckland, for example. I've talked about maximising levers for change, and procurement's a good example. And with that, going where the energy is, we found we didn't have a very receptive procurement team in the council when we started. So we looked for where there was energy and interest, and we found that in Auckland Transport. So we went where the energy was. We didn't try and beat our heads against a brick wall in the procurement department. But as we've made progress and we've demonstrated what's possible, we now have the Auckland Council procurement team finally on board, and a procurement framework being developed for the council that will enable this work even more. I talked about empathising with the system. We've been working with Plunkett and Manarewa, supporting an investment from the Tyndall Foundation and Plunkett in a community-based way. And my team member working on that, Angie, one of her reflections is that she noticed her own lack of empathy, I guess, for Plunkett at times. She had her focus on the whānau and the whānau voice, but wasn't paying enough attention to the system and the people in it and their own situations. And when she started to empathise more with the people inside the system, she noticed that things started to shift and change. So that's a real learning for us, and also with procurement, to have empathy for the procurement practitioners. Looking for mutually reinforcing connections. Now that's really important in a systems way, is how do we, by looking for those mutually reinforcing connections, that's where we can see some magic can happen, and things can really amplify and impact. An example of that in our work is Angie was working with whānau, and Anne-Marie was working with a Healthy Homes initiative, innovating, supported by the Ministry of Health. But when Angie and Anne-Marie started a whānau-led approach to healthy homes, peer-to-peer, getting the knowledge and the skills and capabilities in the hands of grassroots women leaders at a community level, things really started to change. And then finally, and we've heard a little bit about this, and I'm sure this resonates with people here, is that it is all about relationships when you're working in complexity. We've recently done a piece of research with 25 South Auckland community leaders from 16 organisations about working with the TSI team, and we've called it a relational approach because the consistent common theme that came through from the community leaders, the thing that they valued the most was the relational approach, the trust building, the walking alongside that they experienced from the team. And we've published that into a report that describes the relational approach and also the practices that were most valued by communities. And if people are interested, I can send you a copy or email the report. So they're my reflections on the doing of systems change, and now Christina's going to talk about it from a funder perspective.
Thank you so much, Gail. And I do want to acknowledge that we, as the Todd Foundation, are on really, really early stages of this journey. So we're trying to set ourselves up well to support this kind of systems change work. Don't look at us as an example of how to do it. Look at us as an example of how to learn how to do it. Just check, is any of my trustees in the room? Identify yourselves. Not because, because what we've been able to do as the Todd Foundation is because we have had trustees who have trusted us. I really like the fact they have trust in their name. But think about how the role of trustees actually works and how much trust is actually in that role. So really do want to acknowledge that my trustees, as Vu pointed out, they are the people who hold the power about what happens, and they have been incredibly open to thinking and learning in a different way. Funding for systems change. What has our journey been? So I do want to say that we did not set out when we decided to change the Todd Foundation in 2016 to be a systems change funder. I didn't even know what systems change was, hadn't come across that concept. And in fact, I think my first introduction to it was when I was at the International Funders for Indigenous Peoples Hui at Otaki, which was so amazing. And I heard Eru talk about the work of tōkona te reo. So thank you for that. I want to mihi to you for that, because that was my first kind of thinking about, wow. It's like, wow, that's a really great idea. However, what happened for us in 2016 was that we did one of our usual strategic planning exercises, and you probably all do them every 3 years or so. You get together in a room with some sticky notes, with some dots, and decide whether or not your priorities are still good enough, and have you got the right strategies, and should you change your goals, and maybe it's time to shift from funding this area of focus to this other area of focus. And what I suggested to my trustees is that the strategic planning that we did that year didn't focus on what we funded, because we had our big vision and we had a focus on children and families and young people, and our goal areas had stayed the same, and we were all pretty happy with them, really. Maybe we should focus instead on how we funded, the way that we did things, not what we did. And at the time, we were, I think, considered a progressive kind of traditional funder. So we were still a fairly traditional funder. We were experimenting with giving long-term, unsupported, untagged funds. So what Vu was talking about, we would give 5, a lucky proportion of our funding recipients would get, after we'd developed a relationship with them, would get a 5-year relationship of funding, which was really generous, because we gave them 3 years at a certain amount and then kind of tapered it off so that they could go away and become more sustainable by finding someone else to give them the money. It was untagged. They could spend it on whatever they liked. We made absolutely no demands on them to spend it in any particular way. So we thought we were doing pretty good. But actually, 60% of our funding at that time was still allocated through reactive, application-led processes for 1 or 2 years of money at the most. So it was a pretty traditional model, most of what we were doing. And so we did a bit of a review of that and how that was working, and I'm not going to go into all the detail of that. It's on our website. But one of the things that we realised was that our funding practices constrained what could happen as a result of our funding. So I can't emphasise this enough, that the way that you fund constrains what people can do with your money. And if you fund in particular ways, you will just get programs and services and projects that don't think about these bigger picture issues, because they can't, because that's not how your funding will enable them to work, and it's not how your funding enables organisations to work to get innovation and adaptability and all of those things happening. So we actually kind of started, funnily enough, with our, we talked about the mental models in that little bottom corner of the triangle, and the work that we were doing in that strategic process, which actually ended up taking 18 months. It wasn't a 3-day, or 2-day seminar. It was 18 months of going away, thinking about things, working, running workshops with our funding recipients, to ask them, if you could design a funding model from the ground up, what would it look like? That was really interesting. And going backwards and forwards and developing our learning. So what we realised is that as a funder, there were a whole set of assumptions that were underlying our processes that we needed to dismantle. So just going to put some of them up, and we've developed these as we've gone along. These are not exactly the same ones that we looked at, and there are only some. There's a whole lot more. As a funder, we had seen ourselves as a funder of organisations. That was our job, was actually organisations will come to us, ask us for money, and we will give them some money to do a thing. We didn't actually see ourselves as an enabler of social change. That wasn't in our mindset. And so that's probably the fundamental change, is what are we actually here for? What are we here to do, Because there is always more people applying for our money than we had money to give away, the assumption was that we needed to be guardians and gatekeepers of the money, and we had to make sure that the money we were giving went to the very best of the applications, and we weren't wasting any of it on things that weren't going to work, because we were in that scarcity way of thinking, and it was. We always had many times more applications for the money than we had money to give in any particular round. But that created a specific mindset about what we were there to do. And that does lead to low risk tolerance, because you don't want to waste any of the money. So you've got to make sure that you do really good due diligence and put it on a sure thing and fund the thing that works and all that sort of stuff. If you want to be an enabler of social change, you have to move. You have to move into that high trust thinking. You have to think that there is going to be some risk, but we have to balance that against the potential to create change. Vu talked about this morning. Sustainability is the responsibility of the organisation seeking funding, and it's up to them to go away and work out how to make things keep on working. The opposite of that, or the moving on and the mental mode of thinking, is that we need to understand the end game. If we want to enable social change, if we want to see it, then we need to fund in a way and do the things that you need to do to see that through. So it's not just the responsibility of the organisation, it's the responsibility of the funders. And it's another thing that I don't think we think about enough. And I believe that we really need to up our game in this area around our sophistication and thinking. I don't know how many programs I have seen where an organisation, a national organisation or whoever has said, look, it'll be really great, I think this community needs this program, could you please give us some money and we'll come in and do this program. And the funder says, that's great, we'll give you 2 years funding. The program goes in, it starts operating, the money runs out, the people leave, and actually the community who had just started to trust and get to know this organisation and think, oh, it's great, we've finally got some mentoring for our young people. And then the money goes and people are worse off and trust is eroded, and actually, as a funder, if you're doing that, you're responsible for that. I'm sorry, but that's just the reality. So, yeah, we needed to dismantle our assumptions. And so what we ended up with is, oh no, final one. So, sorry, that's the most important one probably, the power one. So where does the power to make decisions sit? And for most of our organisations, the power of making decisions about money sits around the board table. It sits in the room with trustees sitting, and Vu has actually written a really great blog about this. I do read his blog, it's amazing. He is as funny in writing as he is in person, so I really recommend it. But one of his most recent blogs was actually about, you know, to be honest, the people who have the most power to make the decisions have the least knowledge about what will make a difference and what is going on in the ground. And so the kind of assumption that we had to tackle in the Todd Foundation is that the power sits, the decision-making sits with the people who have the most power versus the decision-making should sit with the people who have the most knowledge, okay? And that has meant some changes, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is our new funding strategy. It's still only 5 years, so we've got some work to do, but we used to have 3-year ones, so we're kind of pushing it out. But part of that for us is also going, we're experimenting with this way of working, and this is what we're doing at the moment, and we're going to change that as we go to see, how things work, how we can work better. But what we actually now have is a clarity of purpose. And this funding strategy was co-designed. It was co-designed by board staff and our community partners who gave us a massive amount of thought leadership around what we should do here. We have a much greater clarity of purpose. Our purpose is to resource communities to create sustainable long-term social change. That's our purpose. So what we're not doing is setting our goals and saying, here is our goals that you have to align to. What we're saying is our job is to actually resource the communities. That's our job. And the focus is on that sustainable long-term social change. We have, sorry, I'm just looking at time. So we have some ways of doing things, funding coordinated community-led action for change, and we've really tried to think about how we can do that well. $4 million across the whole of the country, across a really wide range of different things, is not going to go very far. So we have narrowed our focus a little bit to enable us to do that better. We practice and incentivise collaboration. So we have money put aside in our budget just to collaborate with other funders on their work. That is what it is for. It doesn't matter whether or not it aligns with anything else that we're doing particularly, though that's always a bonus, because we're all going to be doing different things. But if we are telling our community sector organisations that they're too competitive and they're not collaborating enough, and we're not collaborating as funders and understanding what it takes to do that, then we are not walking the talk. So we have money put aside just to collaborate with other people. And I encourage you to think about doing that as well, because if you don't, it won't happen. I can tell you that right now, it just won't happen, because your systems and processes start sending you off in different directions. And we also have money to support organisations that support the sector the capability of the whole sector. It's one thing that we can do as a national funder that was uniquely something that we were able to do, because we can fund across the whole of New Zealand. We can fund the organisations that sit across the whole of New Zealand more easily than perhaps some local funders can. So we're more focused so we can understand better. We needed to develop the sophistication in our thinking around the areas that we were trying to work in. So at the moment, that is youth employment and fairer futures, which is about income inequality. So we're working really closely with that piece of work with the Peter McKenzie project, because why wouldn't we? They were years ahead of us on this already, and why would we be setting up our own things when we could actually be working with them? So even though we have separate money put aside for collaboration, we also, within our change funding areas, look to collaborate and to support capability as well. So it's a whole of strategy kind of idea. We're much more flexible in how we fund. So we don't have funding rounds and grant applications anymore, and that is, the thing that kind of people seize on and they go, oh my God, you're not taking applications, like that's the big thing. That's a means to an end. Not having to continually process 200 or 300 applications every 6 months means that we can actually form and develop and be in the relationships with the people who are doing the work and be flexible about what's needed and get them to tell us through those trusting relationships. So the flexibility, which means that we're not just funding programs and services, we're able to fund research, convening, capability, advocacy, evaluation and learning support, all of those things, because we haven't got a structure that constrains us. We're proactive, so we put in the legwork to go out and do stuff. We understand the challenges and the stress that the community organisations and NGOs are under with all of the work that we're making them do, running around, all of us different funders to try and, what did Vu call it, Frankenstein together, the funding. So the very least we can do, we think, is to actually take some of that stress off people by doing as much of the work ourselves as we can. There's so much information available. We've got the charity services stuff, we've got the stuff that's on people's websites, we've got other funders who've already done due diligence on people. Why do we need to make them jump through the hoops again? So we're trying to do a lot more legwork. And yeah, the flexibility in pushing out the funding decisions. So our trustees delegate a lot, not all, but a lot more of the funding decisions to the staff. So what happens is generally our trustees will agree on an approach that we're looking to take and a budget, kind of the amount of money that we think we'll be spending in that. And then they basically say to the staff, okay, go away and do that. Work out who the best people are to do this work and how to, you're talking to them every day, work that out. And then when we get to the point of supporting organisations, the majority of that fund, well, almost all of that funding is, we have an understanding of what we think we're going to do together, but the money is untagged. So if the money needs to be spent in a different way, it can be. And so those organisations are making the decisions about where the money is spent, not us. So moving, and there's another layer, and we haven't cracked it yet, but we need to get to the point where actually the communities who are affected are the main people who decide how that money is spent. So we're on a journey. Thank you, Gail. I was keeping an eye on the time. So yeah, we do have 5 minutes and we did want to have a quick time for questions. My reflections, if you want to go on this journey, be prepared to change absolutely everything that you do, and we have. All of our structures, all of our systems, all of our template letters, every time we do something now, we're doing it for the first time just about, and we're developing that, but it's not easy. We gave ourselves a year, and we probably needed a bit longer than that. And same with capability development. As an organisation, as a board, as a staff team, we have really had to up our capability in these ways of thinking and doing, because we couldn't just rely on what we've been doing before and sit on our laurels and go, we know how to do a grant assessment, we know how to do due diligence, we understand how to convene a round table reporting. We've done that, for 9 years now, so we're good. Learning is not optional, can't stress that enough. We have to find ways of putting our learning back into our decision making and into our development of what we're doing. Awkwardness and messiness are okay. So a lot of the work that we do as funders is actually insulating us from the awkwardness of being asked for money. Isn't it awkward? Doesn't it feel kind of weird when people sort of approach us and it's like, no, this is not the application round. Please don't talk to me about this stuff. I'm not on the clock. And what we have actually realised with our proactive approach is that we have to take on the awkwardness ourselves. It's kind of uncomfortable to say, well, I want to come and talk to this organisation. I'm not quite sure where this is going to go, but we just want to set up a conversation with you. And we've had to deal with that, and we've had to deal with messiness that, as that video showed, systems change is complex and messy. We don't always know where things are going to go when we start funding. We don't know if it's going to work. We don't know what the results are going to be. We're not going to be able to aggregate up some impact and put it in our statement of service performance at the end of the year. And that's another thing I've got some issues with, but that's another thing I could rant on. We are part of the system too as funders, and coming back to that, how we fund actually impacts what can happen. So don't think that we sit outside the system. Everything that we do is part of that system. And we're all in this together. So the Todd Foundation can try and be the most amazing system funder in the country and do it really, really well, but if we don't have friends, if other people aren't thinking in the same way and doing stuff, if the community organisations aren't being supported in their capability, nothing is going to change. So we're really, really open to talking to people, thinking about if this kind of funding might be a good way of doing things for you. And you don't have to go all in. We've gone all in because we only got $4 million and we didn't have the capacity to keep running a traditional model and a systems change funding model at the same time. We had to make a choice. But a lot of people, that's not the right model for them, and they're doing that with some of their money and not others, and that's all good too. So sorry, I've nearly taken up all of the time. There might be time for a question or two. And please come and grab us afterwards if you would like to talk more about this.
Does the Todd Foundation fund environmental initiatives?
No, we're solely in that social funding space. We always have been, pretty much, but we've really got to focus on children, families and young people. Yeah. Marianne?
Gail, you
I think that something that really helps is being prepared to invest in understanding the complexity of the issue we're grappling with and open to the not knowing. Everybody wants to know what's the answer, how do we fix this, but I think we've learnt that it's not quite that simple in some areas. Something that hinders maybe is, this isn't a funding example, but I had breakfast with some people from the Ministry of Education this morning that we're working with on a project, and their anxiety actually is a hindrance because I guess it starts to diminish the trust, and we have to put a lot of effort into building confidence and trust and marketing what we're doing when really we need to be in this together, as Christina said. And just my last plug, this is the relational approach report that I was mentioning before if people are interested. And also we've just produced a year in review for the TSI about our work, and in the back there's a section on what we're learning that goes a bit further than what I've talked about this morning if people are interested.
We had some key messages.
I think leaning into the complexity and not trying to simplify things that really are those wicked problems. And we do ourselves find sometimes it's a struggle to lean in. It's hard graft. That's probably my key takeaway. And there aren't any. If there were silver bullets, we'd have solved a whole lot of these issues already. There are no silver bullets. A Canadian colleague in this field, Mark Cabage, makes that message very strong, but he does say there could be silver buckshot. So we need to make those sort of bets, but not look for the one answer that's going to fix all these things.
Thank you. And those last 3 bullet points are mine. So I think I probably talked enough about those. But yeah, just if there's one thing you think about as a funder is really understand that your systems and processes absolutely constrain what people can do or enable them. So you've got a choice, as Boo said, to keep constraining people or start enabling them more in whatever way you're funding. Thank you very much.